I'm happy to welcome back to the Integral Stage 4 members of our Integral Ufology series. We are joined by Sean Esbjorn-Hargens, Stuart Davis, Dierkes, and Layman Pascal. Phase 1 of our Wheel of Perspectives involved each participant presenting a personal statement on the topic, and we gather now for Phase 2, in which we will hold a group dialogue around 8 mutually generated questions. We hope that our exploration today can further open up this very slippery and significant topic, and also spawn some new insights or synergies among and through our perspectives and experiences. As usual, I will include links to some relevant resources and references in the video description below, so please check that out if you're interested. And now, without further ado, we'll start with our first question. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
What experience have you had with UFOs or ET-related phenomena that you still feel you have the most to unpack or digest?
That was a really interesting question to think about, because I don't think of the experiences that seem the most graphic and vivid for me. You know, I've seen craft, things that look like craft in the sky and on the ground, and anomalous entities, and interactions with parts of nature that seem like they defy the inner outer single plural distinction. But all of that suits me fine. Seems like it's part of what I anticipate the world to be. The things that are like the grain of sand in my boot, or the chunk of the wisdom apple still stuck in my throat, I think of certain kinds of video evidence that I've seen, and how frustrating it is not to know what to make of these things. What counts as evidence? What am I seeing? Who do I believe? That kind of knife's edge where I can't discredit or credit something that I'm witnessing being recorded. That is an ongoing point of irresolution for me. Then the other thing I thought of was a certain class of dreams where I really feel like I've solved this thing to my own satisfaction, and that I'm ensconced with a class of being that is the solution, and that sees the world in a way that's so completely different from waking consciousness or from any human transcendental states. And when I step out of those dreams, I feel like I'm so close to something that's so familiar, and it's just a half an inch away from me. And that's an endless source of vexation, like the frustration and the deliciousness of a koan. So that's where I keep getting rubbed.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad we're starting with this question, Bruce, because, it allows us all to put some skin in the game, in the sense that often it's really easy to have these conversations and talk about these things from a distance, and to ruminate on them and speculate, and that can be very safe, even though the topic often is not that safe. But to kind of bring it home in this way, I think just allows us and the viewers to just enter into a much more deeply personal dimension of this. And that's one of the reasons I love this topic and these related topics and this phenomenon. I feel it's radically personal in a variety of ways. And a lot of us are just kind of waking up to that in our own journey. I think for me, kind of what's left undigested, if you will, in my own set of experiences are a number of different encounters with what I would maybe label extra-dimensionals, for lack of a better term, that have left me really wondering about the nature of the soul, the nature of my own soul, different timelines, parallel lives. I had a very vivid experience of being a mantis being. And so, just kind of this set of experiences have kind of deconstructed my singularity, right? And really opened me up to the lived experience, and also kind of the kind of, conceptual inquiry into my own multidimensional expression, and how am I connected to these beings in ways that maybe I'm just starting to understand or explore. In what ways am I more than just what I take myself to be in terms of a singular soul on a particular arc of evolution and development? And maybe there's aspects of myself in other dimensions or in other realms that are having their own unique, Sean experience, and that's contributing to my own evolutionary, process and my own, maturation. So these, these interactions with these beings have, really brought to me kind of this deep inquiry that's a big part of exo-studies that I've been pioneering, is kind of what's the ontological status of these beings. And we'll get into this, I think, in some of the other questions, but I think grappling with that, not just from like a philosophical or kind of integral perspective, but like from a deeply personal place, is both kind of the driver in a lot of my inquiry around this, but also what leaves me the most disoriented in a wonderful way.
Yeah, I think the toughest thing for me right now is the chasm between what's available for me to experience and know from my humanity and what I intuit to be on the other side of that chasm in terms of non-anthropomorphic sentient intelligence. And it might be useful to specifically refer to the mantis entities because that's where most of my experience has been. But I find myself spending a lot of time and energy in not quite a paranoid fashion, but in a way that is me continually sending a sonar signal, trying to find out if I'm accurately perceiving specifically the intention and the motivation behind these experiences and behind this. I want to call it a relationship, but I'm not sure it is. And that's one of the things that is most difficult for me, is that I'm not sure that a relationship is possible because of the disparity between my locus and theirs. And then that causes me to be concerned that I and many other human beings are perceiving through a distortion, or we're being manipulated, or that simply the motivation and objective of these entities can't be known. And that really bothers me. I don't know if that's true or not, but I find myself in the last year probably spending the bulk of my time trying to determine, what is this all about? Why am I involved? What do they want? Can I know what they want? How is this? I also worry a lot that we're not ready and we can't be ready collectively for the relationship if it continues to progress, and if it one day crosses over the threshold and becomes explicit and more permeated through the membrane into our waking reality, so to speak. That's the thing I'm struggling with the most as of late.
I really appreciate the question and everybody's responses. My interaction is largely through my work with individuals, and I never started saying that, hey, had any UFO encounters lately? Come on over. People just started showing up that had any number of anomalous and in this rough kind of category. And it's been interesting for me. The kind of question has been figuring out ways to support people to stay grounded and contained in their own being, whatever their experience and the energy and the emotion that might be behind that, without necessarily getting to resolution or an answer. Most of the time, folks are coming in looking for an answer, thinking that will then assuage whatever kind of stuff has been stirred up for them. And me kind of constantly saying that you can actually come to a place of some degree, at least, as a kind of a moving target of integration, cohesion anyway, that may not be an answer. So I'm always kind of in a, not exactly an agnostic position, that wouldn't really be accurate, but in a, I'm not quite sure, and trying to assist people in making sense and finding it interesting that people can walk in their path, even if they haven't come to a complete, finished understanding of their own experience around this one. It is slippery, I think.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I have maybe two areas that remain a bit undigested, unprocessed for me. I've mulled on them for a long time. One was a set of visionary experiences I had when I was living out in the wilderness. I was camping out, and I lived in the canyon lands of Arizona for a number of months. And I had 4 nights of experiences that just happened right in a row. And they were pretty intense for me, and I didn't immediately interpret them in UFO terms. They seemed more shamanic initiatory. The first night I was sitting shirtless in my tent in the dream, and something stuck its head through the flaps of the tent and breathed on my back, and it was a buffalo breathing on my back, and I realized something big is coming. I just woke up thinking something big is coming. And the second night I woke up and I was half awake and half asleep, and that I couldn't move my body, but I could hear the night sounds outside of the tent. And a voice was speaking to me and talking to me about the nature of consciousness for about 6 hours. And I just laid there listening to these instructions on the nature of consciousness. And on the third night, I was visited by a group of beings that seemed both menacing and powerful and somehow intimate. One leaned in and kissed me on the ear and said, "Come." And they took me out into the woods and put me through some initiatory kinds of experiences. One was I had to relax standing inside this indentation that had been made in the ground, and my body began to spontaneously move in Tai Chi-like movements, but I was self-conscious and it didn't end up flowing properly, and they said, "Let's try something else." They had me bend over backwards, and this beam of light shot from the center of the hole up through my middle, and I just rotated up that beam of light, and my whole visionary expanse just expanded into something I couldn't conceive in terms of my ordinary waking consciousness. It was just a vast display of undigestible phenomena. And then I got self-conscious in that and collapsed to the ground, and I had a sense of a bit of disappointment. And they said, "We'll come back." And the fourth night I woke up and I was suspended above a body of luminous blue water, a couple inches above the water, and I knew that the water was intelligent and was communicating to me. And there was a kind of psychic, wordless exchange with that body of luminous water that I felt was on another world. And later I read some of Whitley Strieber's books that actually had just come out. It was because these events were before he started publishing. And a number of the sequences of events that he went through actually matched this: the luminous blue water, the dancing spontaneously in a circle, but which for him turned out to be a means of being shown different worlds. For me, I couldn't do it. I didn't go there. The second seemed to show me something different, the light tower experience. And somebody had whispered at the end of that dream when they said they would be back, it said, you must learn to bear the weight of the tree, whatever that means. So that's one experience I've just digested for a long time, and it's yielded some personal meanings, but it's so much on the visionary side and not on the hard tech side that I didn't think about it as an ET encounter until I read Strieber's books and I saw parallels to what he was experiencing. And there's this boundary and blurry area between, the visionary and shamanic and the ET phenomena. And the other, since I don't want to go on too long, but I went on a CE5 expedition with Stephen Greer's, one of his groups. I was invited to go along on that. Just there was an experience that was classically what you hear about, both the strong physical evidence there and some visionary dreamlike content and some contemplative states. And they all blurred together in a way that it just left me with a puzzle of experiences in terms of people had some dreams the night before. We were at Stonehenge and sitting out every night in the barrows next to Stonehenge trying to do the initiating contact. And some people had some interesting dreams before. We did a contemplative experience where people had shared kind of visionary experiences in the contemplation. And it had been a clear, cloudless night when we started. And when we came out of the meditation, we looked up, there was a cloud about 6 feet above the head, thick bank of fog that was super warm on this cold English night, that it felt like I was putting my face in front of a radiator. It was just this heat coming out of a cloud that was just over the whole group. And it felt like something was behind the cloud. It felt something super hot. And some other different kinds of visionary things happen for people. And then the next day we discovered that about 200 yards away from us, a crop circle had appeared overnight in this farmer's property. And we went back the next day to investigate it. And the farmer wouldn't let us over the fence to look at it. My wife pretended she had to go pee, and she went off and she snuck over the fence and she walked around inside it. And she said it was exquisite, just really remarkable, in the way that it was laid out. And she, not an ET or UFO believer, but came out of there kind of shaken by how remarkable it was. So that was just for me a classical blending of the visionary and the concrete that I'm still mulling over, especially since I went to that CE5 experience kind of skeptical and even a little bit mocking in my mind when they were tweaking with the machines and getting all the beeps and bloops. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but stuff happened. So.
How does integral theory contribute to the study of UFOs? What are its main elements that make a difference? And how does ufology contribute to integral?
Yeah, I think the two most obvious things that integrative thinking can contribute is, on the one hand, the developmental context. That we have some kind of idea that there's different styles of culture and cognition that contribute to how we perceive and conceive experiences of a certain kind, entities of a certain kind, things like that. The notion of striated styles of encounter with what might be the same entities, and in an organized fashion. I think the other thing that it has to contribute is the trans-rational attitude, right? An attitude that's not preemptively closed to either rigorous rational thought or any kind of experience. And I think part of that is the skill of trying to take perspectives that seem foreign to you seriously. Like, one of the things that holds up the whole enterprise is that we all feel, Bruce mentioned the mocking, there's an emotional quality of thinking that something's just ridiculous or too far off the map to spend your time on, that you're hearing from someone who's deluded in some way. And there's an embodied, intentional skill of wanting to get to the perspective that's on the other side of your own reaction. I think that's an essential thing. I think the UFO studies community has to practice that kind of a skill, as well as mainstream people have to sort of practice a skill like that in order to make any sense of what people are saying on the subject of UFOs. What ufology contributes to integral thinking, again, maybe two things. The first thing is it is a serious challenge to the categories that we use, right? It maybe doesn't invalidate them, it maybe does. But I always have the picture in my mind of like, say, the AQUIL map, or all the types of perspectives are laid out on a carpet, and under the carpet is a mouse, and you just see this bulge and it moves around indifferently to the categories. And that's something, if that happens, if there's phenomenon like that, then we have to think differently, or seriously at least, about how valid these categories are and what it would mean for something to be able to violate them or span them or be essentially part of more than one at the same time. The other thing it might have to contribute is reframing our sense of what the leading edge is. It's very easy to get a naive idea that the leading edge is at the front of some process. But if what's happening on the earth right now has happened many times on many worlds over a huge span of time, then we're not quite at the leading edge in that naive sense, right? We may be at stage 3 of a process that goes to 10 stages and has occurred 1 billion times. So what we mean by the leading edge is a phenomenon that it can occur at every threshold, at every step. You know, something's being folded in, some kind of novelty is emerging, but you're not necessarily at the front or at the top of a process when you're at the leading edge novelty of emergence.
I love this question. I think in my individual video that's part of the series, towards the end, I give like 10 to 12 reasons on each of these two questions you've asked, Bruce. So, I'm ongoingly kind of considering, what does integral bring to this exploration, and then how does the UFO ET phenomenon contribute or engage integral? I think part of it, starting with, what does integral bring? The phenomena is so multifaceted. There's so many different layers and dimensions. In fact, it's arguably more than one phenomenon. It's like there's over like a dozen arguably discrete, expressions of reality and phenomena that just kind of get lumped together, but also seem to share some kind of underlying paranormal ontology that relates them all in one way or another. And so I have a hard time imagining how to approach this topic with anything less than an integral kind of map and mode of being and, style of inquiry. It's so complex, it's so confusing, it's so disorienting, it's so challenging to our categories and I think, this is partly why the field of ufology is so fragmented. Most disciplines are and have their different quadrant camps and levels camps and all of that we can analyze. But I think it's almost, that dynamic is exacerbated in the UFO context just because it's such a bizarre mix of science and spirituality and tech and shamanic and, it's just like there's just so much going on. So I think, the four quadrants, just as a starting point, I noticed right away that it pretty well describes the four main camps of, how people interpret and make sense of the UFO phenomenon. You have the nuts and bolts folks, you have the consciousness, paranormal folks, you have the Jungian archetypal, social collective psi phenomena folks, and then you have the earth energies, geomagnetic, dynamics folks, right? So just that's a very helpful starting point to kind of get some bearings on some of the competing narratives around what's going on. But also I think for me, the piece around enactment and what I call the who times the how times the what, and how our epistemologies, our methodologies, and our ontologies are complexly interrelated and co-constitutive of each other, that helps me a lot in trying to make sense of all of this. And I think the phenomenon is uniquely spiritual and it's uniquely scientific, and Integral provides a powerful philosophy that integrates science and religion. And so I think there aren't a lot of other kind of metaphysical frameworks that I think kind of hold both the science aspect and the spiritual aspect. And so I think Integral is uniquely positioned to contribute and help people kind of navigate all of that. All that said, I think there's a lot that the UFO phenomenon brings to Integral. And I like what Layman was saying about challenging the categories, because it really does. If anything can be said about the phenomenon, it's how it really fucks with all of our categories, be they integral categories or just our categories about reality in general. And it's one of the things that I love about the study of this is because it really forces us to open and surrender and rethink our mental models and how we're trying to make sense of all of this. But a few things that I think UFO does and brings to Integral is it expands us into what I would consider like a galactic-centric orientation and invites us to go beyond the world centrism and the planet centrism that I think Integral is so good at naming and articulating and calling forth, and allows us just to take that to the next natural evolutionary step of what does it mean to be galactic citizens, and what does it mean to have a mode of consciousness that embraces all beings at a galactic level. And so it's, in this sense, it's kind of, I talk about, it includes the cosmos with a C, right? Whereas, Ken often emphasizes cosmos with a K, and that's a very, powerful aspect of Integral. But I feel that this reinserts the cosmos with a C. The other piece, and I think we'll touch in on this in some of the other conversations that are coming up, is around the subtle realm and the subtle beings and subtle senses. And while Integral has a place for that in its map, I don't think it does a good job of theorizing or developing that aspect of Integral theory. So I think the UFO phenomena really requires us to kind of revisit and expand our expressive capacity around the subtle realms and the types of senses and modes of consciousness that allow us access into experiencing the subtle dimensions. And then how do we make sense of the types of landscapes and beings that we encounter there? So I think all of that helps bring Integral to the next level. And then ironically, I've been, excited to point out as of late that I think it's the UFO phenomena that's actually going to be the catalyst for people to move into Integral stages of development. and that, you know, both at an individual and a collective level. So I think, ironically, and maybe much to Ken's chagrin, that it'll be the UFO phenomena that actually helps our culture move more towards an integral expression.
Wow, this is so cool. I'm really getting intoxicated just listening to this wonderful conversation. For me personally, that's where I'd like to come at this question from, is my own personal experience and how integral from the very beginning functioned as this imperative in my life to include and inhabit more. In the most simple distillation, that is what it is for me to this day, which is to try to include and inhabit more to whatever degree is possible with whatever is available. And that piece has served really well in helping metabolize, to whatever extent possible, things that are kind of impossible to metabolize. This enigma, this set of phenomena, and I agree, Sean, that there's this, almost one of the hilarious things about the phenomena is even trying to discern how many discrete puzzles we may be looking at here, and the way in which they web and weave together is infinitely confounding and beguiling to me to this very day. So the imperative to include and inhabit more allowed me immediately at least to have a response and interest and curiosity in the phenomena in a way that was completely workable and fits with my cosmology. So for me to see the cosmos as animated, sentient, and populated by an infinite range of intelligences worked perfectly. And then for me to feel the imperative of trying to include and inhabit them as aspects of an identity that's infinitely mysterious, that I am a part of and that is a part of me, has made it a little easier to live in the unresolvable, knowing that at least I am part of this living system. And although I may not understand it and possibly never will to the degree that I would like, I can still be a participating positive member in this great expanse of sentience. And integral has helped me a lot with that. The other one that's been important for me is, Layman touched on it initially, which is the transrational. It's such a relief to me to have an orientation and a compass and integral that includes naturally the transrational. I think a great risk for a lot of folks who are contending with these enigmas and don't have an integral toolbox to work with is that it's so easy to feel crazy. So much about this can make you feel crazy, even when the transrational is part of your native experience of day-to-day life. And I know that if I hadn't have had room for the transrational as a felt part of my experience inside the phenomena and out, I just might have come off the rails so many more times than I have. It's really, and that segues to the second part of the question for me, which is, what does the set of phenomena bring to integral? And I couldn't agree more with the category busting facets of it. It is a great transgressor. Many times in my experience, in a very sacred way. A lot of what I experience in these range of phenomena is the kind of transgressing of boundaries and categories that beckons and demands me to keep growing and expanding and trying to my ability, meet the phenomena where they are instead of collapsing them and shrinking them into my smaller frame of reference and my little sphere of personal familiarity with the reality that I'm okay with. So I think in my experience as a integrally curious person and passionate person, I feel the phenomena not necessarily destroying integral, but certainly inhabiting and animating and radiating this omission, the great omission. And it hasn't necessarily been an omission intentionally on our part. It's just that we can see this thing coming over the horizon, and the feeling in my soul is like, holy shit, what the fuck is this? Like, it's so big and deep. We didn't need, and now it's here. And that is the magnet pulling me into that great Mr. Beyond. And I feel it can contribute. I see the future of integral in there. I feel the future of integral in there, knowing just to look at one mantis entity and think, what kind of consciousness is in there? how can I even begin to bridge this tremendous, bewildering miracle of this meeting that is underway? So that's what I feel on both sides of that question.
Yeah, again, really, I just really appreciate everybody's thoughtful responses. In terms of integral, a thinker I've been thinking of in relation to this is Jean Gebser. So Gebser thought that, we have these sort of evolving, or he would say sort of mutational structures of consciousness, and mutation is an interesting metaphor given this context with potentials around so-called hybridization and all of that. But for Gebser, we're living in kind of the breakdown of perspectivism. We're living in the breakdown of the mental rational structure of consciousness. Its latent phase. And in the midst of the breakdown of one structure, a great degree of chaos occurs, dissonance and noise. And it's very tricky to find signal in the midst of such cacophony. So, I mean, we kind of know that well beyond the UFO world in just terms of the kind of nuttiness of the time we live in. But on the other hand, the time when the one structure is breaking down and the other hasn't yet necessarily fully taken hold or evolved is a time where gaps occur and strange things can occur in the gap. And I, similarly, along the lines of what others have been saying, I think whatever this phenomenon is, it's a violation of the structure of consciousness that we've all been living under. It's some kind of, whether that's has manipulative elements, whether that has potentially evolutionary elements or magnetic elements, I think is kind of a big open question. But the phenomenon violates our known version of physics. It violates our sense of humanism, that like all of our legal systems and political systems and economic systems and most environmental systems are all predicated on a human-centric model, and kind of human sovereignty being the source and the center of thought and reflection and action. And it's a violation of that. It's a violation, arguably, of people's sense of personal autonomy in terms of the more certain like lights in the sky or abduction type phenomena. So it's, I've been thinking of it along the lines of what Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject. It's this thing that's kind of, like Stuart was saying, everywhere, but we also can't talk about it. Richard Dolan, I think argued very accurately that the UFO phenomenon is kind of the hidden hand in the entire development of the national security state and apparatus, as well as the kind of surveillance state that's kind of been built, piggybacked off that. So that would be kind of just whatever we think about this topic, it'd be kind of interesting just even historically or politically to say, hey, by the way, this phenomenon is important if for no other reason than the entire national security apparatus has kind of been profoundly developed in response to this phenomenon. That conversation is simply occulted. That doesn't happen. So hyperobjects are things that are there, Morton says, that we just can't. They're kind of like these Lovecraftian monsters. They just sort of appear and we don't know what to do with them. So we just kind of go, bah, or we just ignore them. And that's kind of what we're doing with this phenomenon. Like millions of people at this point have had incredible, enigmatic, strange, sometimes traumatizing, initiatory, all manner of responses. And it's simply not able to be publicly discussed. And as that structure of mental rationality breaks down, I think this conversation comes into the gap. And integral, I think, can be very helpful then, as others have mentioned, to start to at least have some coherence, some degree of trying to make some sense of a thing that's otherwise a violation of our current structure based on perspectives. Like Gebser said that he theorized, that speculated that whatever the next structure of consciousness might mutate would be a-perspectival. That was about all he could say. And in terms of how the craft maneuver in the air, even, I think of that as somewhat a-perspectival, much less the manner by which seemingly material craft are having psychic effects in people. So I think we're going to have to enter into a space where we don't know. And our maps are helpful to a degree, to what others have said in terms of the second half of the question. But also, our maps of integral in many senses are perspectively based. And I think this phenomenon is going to force us to mutate our consciousness, whatever that means, beyond a perspective orientational structure, which will be far out, if nothing else.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I don't know if I have much that I can add on. I think a lot of what I would say would echo what most of you have said. I think one concrete thing that Integral brings is its integral methodological pluralism into the field of ufology, in terms of really an explicit injunction to pursue the study along multiple lines at once and then cross-correlate what we find. Because we do find the breaking apart into multiple camps typically, and they don't communicate that well. It's the same, I think Sean talked about it in his original presentation. It's the same you found in psychology, where there's multiple schools and they don't talk to each other. And so I think Integral can facilitate some communication among the existing UFO camps and possibly synergize something new through its integral methodological pluralism. So I hope that that's a promise there. At least it gives us the semblance of something coherent and rational and orderly to do as we enter into maybe a wilderness territory that ultimately, as Lovecraft would lead us, those kinds of neat categories and tools will ultimately fail us, and we'll have to rely on something else. But at least it's a good way to enter into that field, I think, culturally. So I think there's promise there. For me personally, I've always liked experimenting, at the edges of what I'm able to think, and that used to show up for me in either trying to learn very strange, for me, or rule-breaking languages, something that's very different from how I normally think and process. And it also showed up as an experiment for me to try to create a language that didn't function at all along the lines of what I'm used to organizing the world. And so I think the ET phenomenon, the idea of encountering other intelligences that may operate very differently, is just, if anything else, a good cultural and psychic stimulator for us to go to the edges of how we organize the world, to cast into relief some of our assumptions, and to begin to experiment with alternate modes of perception that might be fruitful for us. I wasn't that serious, when I would hear Wilbur sometimes talking about the leading edge of evolution, and it was always framed in human terms. And I think he's being reasonable with that. We don't know very much that we can say concretely about alien intelligences out there. But my feeling all along then was, hey, let's not cap evolution right here with what's going on with the humans. There may be much more out there going on in terms of already grooves cut in the cosmos for what our evolutionary possibilities might be. And theoretically, we can imagine, is there a possibility for overlap in the human world with whatever else has been carved out in other civilizations, whatever else is out there, that we can influence each other. Kind of a mirror to that, almost the reverse perspective on that, was offered by Tom in his talk. And Tom had said the youngest being is often the most evolved being, because they fold most of development in themselves, more than prior generations. So one of his speculations is, it is in some sense legitimate to think about humans as being possibly a near leading edge cosmically or galactically, because we might be one of the younger civilizations, and actually we might be folding more of the cosmic grooves in our own development than we really are aware of yet. And there may be more potential and possibility for us there. So I liked his suggestion along that line, and I hold both of those things, that I don't want us to prematurely presume that whatever we can imagine is the leading edge of whatever is out there. And at the same time, I like the idea that maybe we do fold more in than we anticipate. So I think that's as much as I'd like to say on that topic.
Are the hard approaches, craft, bodies, tech, and soft approaches, vision, shamanic, psionic, spiritual, really part of the same issue, or two or more different phenomena?
Well, I think it's seductively easy to sit around and postulate a class of beings, hyperdimensional or advanced subtle or many worlds, retrocausal, future echoes of ourselves, that defy the difference between the subtle and the gross, between the hard and the soft, between the inner and the outer. Almost too seductive for me personally, so I'm suspicious of that. I know that it's easy to become obsessively interested in things that are sometimes hard and soft. UFO dick joke. There's that, trying to figure out how something can fulfill all those categories simultaneously is personally obsessive to me. So much so that I have to tell myself to take it very seriously that these might be completely distinct classes of experience that have just gotten lumped together and conflated over the years because they're all equally anomalous and they're all of interest to the same type of people. So my answer is I have no idea. I think we have to take both the idea that they are and that they aren't very seriously.
Yeah. Building on that, my sense is, and this is where I think the rubber really hits the road, because this is where it gets really juicy, because, so many of the phenomenon within this category, whether we're talking about UFOs or ETs, extra-dimensionals, cryptids, poltergeists, ghosts, psi phenomena, Bigfoot, all of those phenomena that are in various ways interrelated within the UFO context are both, hard. There's physical evidence for all of those things, different kinds of physical evidence, and very concretely, very well documented. It's not necessarily smoking gun physical evidence, but it's physical evidence nonetheless that shows that there is some gross realm dimensionality to all of these phenomena. At the same time, they're very subtle and they're elusive and they're shape-shifting and they're amorphous and they're trickster-like. And so I think this is why, for me, I feel like we really need to acknowledge that they are separate and they are the same. And this is where it gets paradoxical. And I often think of this set of phenomena, in a sense, as one way of connecting with the turquoise level of consciousness. Like, if you want to know what turquoise looks like, this is it, right? This is where all of these categories blend and mix, and in such a way where the division between subject and object, inner and outer, like dissolves and it dances around. And so I take the position that on the one hand, they are separate. And in some cases with some of the phenomenon, in some examples, it's separate. And in other cases, it's not, and it's mixed. So it's both subject and object. And in some cases, it's just subject. In some cases, it's just object. And in some cases, it's neither. And so I've been developing this notion of doubleness to try and refer to kind of this complexity and this kind of ontological pluralist view that these phenomena are not singular in their ontology, that they're multiplied. There's a multiplicity of ontological expressions here. And given kind of your cosmic address or different vantage points in a perspectival space, it might be enacted or perceived primarily in a hard sense or in a soft sense, but that doesn't preclude the full manifold expression of the phenomena occupying other potential possibilities. And so when I look at the different phenomena, paranormal phenomena that's interrelated in the UFO context, I do feel that there is some kind of shared ontology that's very dynamic and really challenges, any kind of scientific materialist view of ontology or what's real. So part of this is actually just transforming what we mean by what's real and what's concrete and what has ontological status. There's three primary liminal boundaries that I keep identifying that show up across these phenomena. One is the subject-object, inner-outer, that gets deconstructed. The other is the micro-macro, and the other is space-time. These three boundaries seem to be constantly violated by all of the phenomena. So there's something about the ontology of it and the enactment of it that seems to cut across what we generally think of as subject, object, micro, macro, and space-time. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I love this. First, to underline and affirm what Layman was sharing there, in my own experience, like, I am suspicious of my own interpretation of this question. I was appreciating what he was sharing there, because I do find myself, when inquiring on this kind of thing, I'm also simultaneously suspicious of me being seduced by a version of this that I like or prefer, because clearly I'm bringing all of my preferences into how I would like this to shake down. I mean, even just as an artist, there are facets of this phenomena, facets of these phenomena that I really love, and I can feel myself secretly hoping that they shake out that way, because I would like a universe that functions and operates that way. You know what I mean? So that, to affirm with him, like, I'm suspicious of how I interpret things. I try to keep that in check and try to inoculate myself against those preferences to what degree is possible. And then to tag on with what Sean offered there, one thing he's come up with that I just love and really feel has been useful to me is the doubleness. The doubleness. And as you were just sharing now, Sean, about the doubleness, it kicked me back to, I remember one of the very first communications that I ever got from what I, to this day, would most likely interpret as a non-human intelligence was, there's no such thing as two times, there's no such thing as two places. It was right out of the box, doubleness. It was this, the conversation starter was, if we're gonna talk, you gotta, this is home base. No such thing as two times, no such thing as two places. And carried forward, that's been, ironically, one of the consistencies in these phenomena is the doubleness. It's weirdly one of the things you can depend upon. I mean, it's vexing, it induces cosmic orders of vertigo, but it's dependable. And if I am able to get myself into a disposition which can be friendly or at least amenable to that doubleness, that's where something can begin. You find yourself cogitating in that transrational functionality, which, again, I have felt that creativity has been super powerful and useful, because that's just this ceaseless process of something coming from nothing. That's another one of those liminal thresholds, the doubleness of how creativity operates. At least gives us the base some of the base spiritual, cosmological grammar to begin to have that, conversations which takes place. And also ties into what you were sharing, Bruce. I think that's so fascinating. I didn't know that you had tried to create a language that would function differently. That's exactly what I did. I have spent 15 years on this language which functions in a completely different fashion than anything I'd ever known or experienced, expressly to try to get myself acquainted with something that would be an order of other that could maybe give me some tools to have a conversation with whatever is out there, whatever is possible. So I just think that that's so fascinating to hear that from you, and I would love to know more about it. Yeah, so that's my take on that one.
Cool. Yeah. We mentioned pieces around the subtle, and I've been thinking sort of an integral language, the psychic, often, which could be categorized, not that our categories are the biggest thing in the world, but it sort of blends to subtle but gross, right? And it has this dual or double or liminal kind of quality of being the conscious disposition of materiality. And for me, that's been a helpful frame in terms of linking up various interrelated aspects of the phenomenon. Like, why is there strange overlap with apparitions of the Virgin Mary? Why is there strange overlap with fairy folk or the Holda folk or the jinn, which in the Islamic tradition are an interesting, weird third category of creature. They're not human and they're not angels or demons. They're this kind of weird third thing that's referred to as a being made of smokeless fire, which I was thinking of, Bruce, when you were sharing about the cloud and the heat right above your head when you're at Stonehenge. So to me, I often wonder if aspects of this phenomenon are essentially dispositions of the world soul, possibly. Or if we think of them more extraplanetary, then the consciousness of various planets or star systems. And the psychic is interesting because it's the sort of altered conscious disposition of the gross realm, which to me maybe offers an interesting window into this whole thing about their craft, but they go in and out of radar and they propulse against what we understand to be gravitational force. They go turn off and on nuclear sites seemingly at will, pull people out of their beds. Either that's subtle body astral traveling, or maybe it's also in their physical form, but others don't seem to notice. Time slips. Plus, obviously, all of the psychic and sort of psionic realities that tend to occur for people in response to these phenomena. And I wonder if that fact that it has both material and seemingly immaterial manifestations is because a lot of it might be located directly at that kind of doorway point between the gross and the subtle. I mean, another example that I might think of is like scars, implants, strange body markings in this phenomenon. And I've always wondered if those are kind of somewhat parallel to like stigmata in Catholic mysticism, where people have, the wounds of Christ on their hands or their feet, which are interesting because they bleed, but then they're sort of not really any physically understandable symptoms or causality to it, but yet they bleed, but the people aren't really in pain with it. It's and even in that one, only Catholics get it, right? It's not like Buddhists are getting stigmata, and it's even like not even other kind of Christians are getting stigmata. So there's something, I think, very interesting about if Integral were to take more seriously, I think, the psychic, the realm of what's usually called nature mysticism, but probably is more accurately like material mysticism. And again, I think the UFO, as we've said earlier, phenomenon is going to force us to come back to understand the nature of this that I think we've forgotten or neglected, because I think it's kind of right in our faces now.
Now, all of you have really given some good food for thought here. Now, I would say if we take the integral framework seriously as not only a useful heuristic, but as telling us something about the world, then we really have to think about the gross, the subtle, the causal, the interior, exterior, all as constitutive of reality, every unfolding gestalt of every moment, all the time. And so I think we can expect that these phenomena have overlaps in these areas, that there are physical aspects and interior aspects and gross and subtle aspects to a lot of them. And I think what our challenge is really teasing apart how they correlate across these domains. It's not so much that whether they overlap in these different territories. I think from an integral or aqua point of view, they inevitably must. But in the ways that they do, I think sometimes we're being surprised that things that we thought really probably only manifest in this way or over here. And if there's a physical correlation, it's only in the brain and not in any other part. So there may be areas that there are correlations that are unanticipated and still need to be worked out. I think we can probably point to phenomena like, Santa Claus, something like that we're pretty comfortable saying inhabits mostly the interior, except it shows up as social artifacts that we've created. So we can draw the lines fairly clearly with that, we think. Who knows? Maybe somebody's had some pretty unusual experiences with Santa that we are waiting to hear about. But I don't know if I'm going to use these terms accurately. You can go back and fact check me later. But I'm thinking, because I don't usually focus on Western occult phenomena very much in terms of the traditions, but I think there's the idea of the egregore, and also like in theosophy, the thought forms and things like that, where there's this in-between realm where it's an interior phenomena that actually has been entertained and held enough by a collective that it assumes its own autonomous force. And it seems to be able to move around among individual subjectivities because it's been given its own force and stability by the collective for so long. So I think that's something to think about also in terms of, I think major project for Integral really going forward is this kind of parsing and teasing across the different domains in terms of making sense of what's going on in these phenomena.
What is the role of cultivating multidimensional awareness, or cities, to see the subtle realms and ETs, EDs? What is the status of non-human intelligences encountered in ET-related visionary experiences?
I feel like there's a huge role for that kind of consciousness. Obviously, there's a lot of UFO researchers who started out thinking about finding alien bodies and ended up thinking about how they can shift their own consciousness to participate in the experience more. And some of that may be simply because it turns out they don't have the means at their disposal to really investigate the objective phenomenon. But I think there is a growth there towards subtle awareness, multidimensional consciousness. That's where I feel myself interested. I know that there's been a lot of, I don't know how to say, there's been some success in remote viewing. There's been some success in meditating at sacred natural sites. There's been some success in electrical brain stimulation or the use of tryptamine molecules and things like that. So there's a lot of ways where you seemingly can increase the odds of having this kind of experience through a modification of consciousness. And if we're going to make much headway, we have to be dipping into this territory very frequently, hypothesizing a lot of things, doing a lot of experiments, the same way any science would get built up. It can't be whenever it happens to happen to anyone. We're not going to make much progress if that's our methodology. So our methodology has to be more proactive. And the only consistent way you can be proactive, at least on the scale of being just a couple of people in the world, is to try to do it through modifications of your consciousness. So that seems to me the primary area where most people can move toward being more proactive in their engagement.
Bruce, you had also asked about the status of non-human intelligences. Layman, did you want to respond to that as well before I dive in?
No, I left that out. You go ahead.
Great. Yeah, across all these phenomena that we've been naming and highlighting, one thing that really shines through is that consciousness is foundational, that the phenomena is participatory, it's responsive, it seems to be aware of our intentions, it responds to our intentions, like there's an inactive quality. I think this is partly why we tend to then, kind of dismiss it, or it's easy from a scientific, rational culture to dismiss this phenomena because it seems so tied up with some kind of quantum dance with our own embodied awareness. But even Jung talks about how the UFO as an archetype, as a collectively manifested psi phenomenon, will give radar returns, and that it will have physical trace impacts. So this is again this kind of crossing that something that maybe is manifested through collective kind of energy and intention takes on a kind of material expression that then comes back to us as a gross realm phenomena in some sense. So I think the cities are really important in the subtle senses, because as a foundation, we all, generally speaking, share the 5 gross realm senses. And that's a lot of what our consensus of reality is based on, is kind of that we can kind of compare what we see, hear, smell, taste, and kind of can agree on reality more or less. But it gets very interesting with the cities, because different people have different propensities to cultivate different types of cities, different types of psychic capacities, different kinds of subtle senses. And, I've noticed in myself and in people that I've worked with, and that, if you ask, a number of kind of clairvoyants about some topic, they often will zoom in on a different layer of the phenomenon and report that out through their particular subtle senses. So they aren't even sharing the same clairvoyant capacity in the way we might share, vision. And then you add in, clairsentience, claircognition, all the other clairs, and the Yoga Sutras map out like 20 plus different subtle senses, right? And the occult traditions also map out an additional, 10 to 20. So in my estimation, looking at the literature, there's, somewhere between 30 and 50 different subtle senses that can be cultivated. And each of these give us a different window into the phenomenon. So if you think of the 5 senses as kind of like this starting point, then it just like bifurcates out in a tremendous way, where there isn't necessarily a lot of overlap between, if I cultivate 3 or 4 types of subtle senses, and Chris does, and Layman does, and Stuart does, and Bruce does, it still doesn't mean we're necessarily all going to be seeing the same thing, right? Or experiencing the same thing. We might be tapping in again to the multiple ontological nature of the phenomena, and there's some referential overlap, but there's also divergence. And this is kind of what makes this whole field kind of, makes you want to go crazy, because we just don't have the same kind of handlebars that we're used to in kind of making truth declarations about it. And so then the tendency is just to throw it all into the, imagination and hallucination and delusion. In terms of the non-human intelligences, in a similar sense, it's like we have this wide range of what I would consider ontological status. In some cases, these non-human intelligences are just split off parts of our own psyche that we're interacting with, that really, take on almost even sometimes even a gross realm manifestation that we're interacting with. That there is that possibility. And then there's also the tupas. And Bruce, I think it was you that started to point to this of, the Tibetan practice of actually creating a thought form, and that those can start out semi-autonomous, and then they actually can become autonomous and have their own life of their own. And so that's created by individual powers of concentration. Then you have collective, forms of that too, which you mentioned. And then you have the, so I think of the I beings, the non-human intelligence is kind of created through ourself, the we beings with like the collective manifestation of these different beings, and then the it beings, the beings that actually are kind of in some sense, live and are born and die and grow up and mature and like have some kind of either biological or plasma based, or subtle energetic electromagnetic based dimension to their kind of physical form, if you will. So when we're interacting with these non-human intelligences, it could be any one of these possibilities. It could be an I being, a we being, or an it being. And I'm sure there's some other categories to consider too. But that's what makes this such an interesting and fascinating and difficult area to sort through, because how do you discern when you're just interacting with a dimension of your own psyche? How do you discern when you're interacting with some kind of being that has emerged through collective, energy and intention and trauma? How do you know when you're dealing with a being that's actually from a different planet, right? Or a being that lives in a different dimension, right? And these beings themselves tend to be very trickster-like. They lie, they deceive, they manipulate, they, whether, with ill intention or just by the nature of their own selves, that often you don't get what you see, right? And a lot of times these beings will show up in forms in relationship to your own memories, images, and perceptual capacities. So part of what you're seeing is a projection of yourself, right? It is you projecting on the blank screen of the being, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a separate autonomous being on the other end of that enacted experience, right? So I think this is part of what we have to sort through and begin to create expressive capacity to have more sophisticated conversations around the nature of these beings, and how do we relate to them?
Yes. Well put. I'm glad you parsed all that so I don't have to. First, as to the capacities, again, I feel most comfortable with these types of questions, just speaking from my own experience and generally trying not to venture too far afield from that, because it's what I know and it's maybe less speculative in some regards. But for me, the one that's obvious right off the top of the bat is meditation. And so it's just my personal experience to some degree, and also just a general conviction I have, is that the cultivation of all, could be any different modality, but contemplative meditation practices generally light us up on the radar of varieties of consciousness and sentience that we might not be on the radar of if we hadn't cultivated those practices. I've been sitting, I don't know, for more than 25 years or whatever, and I have felt some ambivalence and confusion and frustration around the fact that I do believe that my being a meditation practitioner has meant that I'm involved in things non-human and otherwise, all the stuff that we're talking about in this conversation, that, you know, sometimes I wish I wasn't, and sometimes I wish or feel like I have no privacy because my consciousness, you know, de facto is available to these. There's really actually no such thing as privacy. And so that's a bit of a mixture. And one of the things that's changed for me in the last year is that I entered onto a new kind of a meditation practice with a new discarnate but human partner. And one of the most emphatic things in this new practice is hygiene. So banishing is critical, and it's specifically tied into this. And the basic shakedown for me is that I do want to and should cultivate capacities. It will allow me to have a better relationship with these intelligences and with these mysteries, but doing so also poses risks that are very real. And so to mitigate against that, I need to become really meticulous and committed to hygiene and to banishing. And so now every day of my meditation practice, the first 10 minutes basically is banishing and creating and maintaining these hygiene boundaries. And that has helped a lot. It has brought me some sense of ease and more security. I would not say that I still feel like, you know, I'm not deluded. I don't think as I can prevent these entities from functioning in our space, and I'm not sure that I would want to. That's a big whole conversation in itself. But the cultivation of the capacities I do think is really important and should be pursued, but it should also be done with a real guarded eye toward protection and hygiene. On the flip side of the question, in terms of the ontological status of these entities, I pretty much, what I would like to communicate is what Sean said much more eloquently than I would be able to. And in general, the short of it for me is like, I think it's the whole spectrum. And that's a great way to think of it, as the I, we, it of status of these kinds of intelligences. I think they're all real. And it's really tough to know what the heck you're dealing with. Even over the course of years, it can be very confusing. And again, just in my experience, I do feel as though these entities that I've interacted with, at least, make use of what's available in the environment, make use of what's available in this subtle spiritual ecosystem. And that, of course, includes the contents of the sum total of my soul and consciousness. That can be really confusing, but that's what it is. That's what there is to work with. So that's what I'm trying to do.
I really appreciated what you said there, Stuart, about energetic hygiene, sovereignty, and the development of one's own fundamental boundaries in relationship to this process. That's a principal amount of the work that I do with folks who come in before we get into, like, there's no research agenda. There's not an agenda to prove or disprove or incept a kind of a worldview. I'm not interested in that, but that point is really paramount. So I really appreciate you saying that. And sort of relatedly, the thought I was going to bring, it might not be obvious in terms of multidimensional awareness, but what I've worked a lot with is bringing trauma modalities to this process for individuals who've had various kinds of experiences along a spectrum of so-called positive or negative or anywhere in between, I suppose. And I mean, one of the things that characterizes trauma is that things happen too quickly and intensely for the nervous system to process at the time. That's really a very simple but powerful definition, I think, of traumatic experience, which doesn't mean it has to be negative. You know, giving birth could be an extremely positive experience and also leave layers of dysregulation. And so can these kinds of phenomena, even the ones that seem, you know, blissful and full of light and heavenly sounds and whatever. So they're generally happening too fast. And even if skills and cities are cultivated, which certainly can be, they need to be integrated with the fact that we're human beings in physical biological form. And the human body works at a certain pace, which isn't necessarily the pace that the human mind wants to work at, nor our energy, soul, whatever we want to say, consciousness. And so a lot of the work I find is actually to slow and basically in some ways almost kind of replay experience without entering back into scenes and like re-traumatizing, but actually like slowing down experience way down so we can like actually metabolize as much of the experience as can be metabolized. And that I think is incalculable, whether we're talking this variation of the phenomenon, whether we're talking, you know, intense meditative type experiences. They surface our latent, unprocessed stuff. And life does that, but this is only like that to 11. You know, this is taking it to 11 here. So if we got stuff that's not finished, it's going to get surfaced. And there needs to be a way to safely and cohesively return to ourselves, even if we, again, still don't have a final answer to all of this. But I think Strieber's point, Bruce, you mentioned Whitley Strieber, you know, and he has that line about whatever this thing is, it's the force of evolution upon a conscious human mind. And I think that's a fairly on-point statement, which isn't, it's an ambiguous one. I like its ambiguity. It's not necessarily all inherently light or all inherently negative, but the ability to pace ourselves and to regulate ourselves in the midst of this intensity, the vast intensities of all the forms of the intelligences kind of named, I think is absolutely paramount. And I think it gets short shrift in the literature where we're too, you know, understandably too quickly, like, where do these things come from? And what does it all mean? And what's this? And what about the craft? And what about abductions? What about this? What about people having dreams that come true? And what about the ability to regulate ourselves in the midst of non-ordinary experience? And I think that has a huge impact on the degree to which the intelligence can manifest itself in relationship to us. The state that we're in profoundly influences it as it profoundly influences us. And I think ultimately we need to just, as much as possible, try to normalize the paranormal here.
I like Castaneda's notion, or Don Juan's notion, of the assemblage point. And I think that's something that's relevant here in terms of state practice and development of subtle capacities. I think any kind of contemplative or internal training practice, different yogas and meditation disciplines and fasting and other things, if we really, whether we take on board the whole luminous egg and the, you know, the actual subtle assemblage point as described by Don Juan, we can still think about it as our own organic being, the way that it operates and what gets lit up in the brain and throughout our nervous system. Our different practices will stimulate different parts of our being, and I think influence how and what we enact, right? And so practices can shift our assemblage point and open up new avenues for perception, and experience. And that's definitely been my experience in that when I have been more contemplatively engaged, I've had more of these types of experiences for whatever that's worth. Sometimes they come out of the blue when I'm in the middle of my mundane, everyday, absorbed in my work schedule life, but actually less so. It's more when I've been really deeply, when I was living out in the wilderness or really deeply involved in different practices, that these types of experiences, encounters with other kinds of beings or intelligences have manifested. And I think Stuart's point that if they do exist in some way, which, you know, it sometimes seems that they do, ooh, that's I like the light just shifted something. I think if we have, you know, practices that stimulate those different parts of our being, I think that will open up, you know, different avenues for perception. I think that's something that we want to do. But I liked what Stuart was saying about if we do engage in these practices, we light up in some way that if there are these other beings out there, we attract them, or we elicit some kind of engagement or encounter that we might not otherwise have. And I appreciated also the reference to the hygiene, because especially when I was more actively practicing Bon, Dzogchen, and Mother Tantra, you know, there are very elaborate practices for clearing the space and making a purified environment that I think is really helpful for navigating this especially challenging and dicey territory once you start to invite in experiences that the waking ego is not quite ready for often. So I don't have much more to add. It's hard coming at this point after all of your great explications, because you've said all the great stuff, but thank you.
What is your most reasonable feeling about UFOs? And what is your least reasonable or most idiosyncratically personal feeling about UFOs?
Okay. Let me first say that by going first, I'm never in the position where I get to appreciate and say what I liked about the previous comments. So let me just make a blanket appreciation for what everybody's saying here. As to this question, I don't know if it's positions so much as it is moods or modes of communication. I think there's a mode in which I can sound very reasonable. I think it's sane sounding when I say, look, if there's undisclosed material and technological facts in our civilization that well-intentioned, sane people should push for their public circulation, and that where there's anomalous spiritual, visionary, or ontologically indeterminate experience, that's part of ancient human heritage. It's very meaningful, and you know, well-intentioned individuals should gather together to freely discuss that. I think that sounds pretty reasonable. On the other hand, if I start saying, I really feel that there's an intercategorical class of frequency beings who interact primarily with our unconscious intelligence, and that they're somehow entities, moods, archetypes, and flows all at once, and they inhabit a dimension whose energetic spectrum is orthogonal to electromagnetism, I start to sound peculiar. So I'm let's just say I don't believe that, wink. You know. So there's, to me, it's more about two different modes of thinking and speaking for different contexts, rather than it is so much about holding a plausible and an implausible idiosyncratic perspective.
Yeah, great question. I think for the first part of it, like my most reasonable feeling is we've kind of touched on already, and that is just simply that this phenomena, this set of phenomena represents interrelated realities that all seem in one way or another to cross three key liminal boundaries, you know, of the inside, outside, the micro, macro, and the space time, and that there's some kind of shared ontological, methodological, and even epistemological basis to these interrelated phenomena. And we're just now kind of in the process of kind of teasing that apart and understanding it. And that's a catalyst for the evolution of our categories, the evolution of our own modes of inquiry and research, and an evolution for us as a society for how to, include said phenomenon in a more open, explicit way. And so and we're in the process of that, because I think a lot of these phenomena are intruding not just in our military airspace, but they're intruding into our consciousness individually and collectively in a way where I think we're headed towards a critical point where we're going to have to collectively make more meaning out of this. And so that's my kind of reasonable position. My more idiosyncratic view is that, that there's this mutual enactment where on the one hand, we're projecting this phenomenon. On the other hand, this phenomenon, these beings are projecting us, right? And so it's kind of this post-human position around sentience and fields of intelligence, that there's this mutual enactment where on the one hand, we're projecting it, on the other hand, it's projecting us, and we are part of its projection in some kind of bizarre self-reflective process that's recursive and related to this larger field of sentient intelligence. And so to me, this kind of represents a more idiosyncratic or kind of bizarre inquiry into the doubleness of the phenomenon at this kind of macro scale, that it's mutually implicating that we are as much their projection as they are ours. And so how do we come to terms with that? What does that really mean?
Wow, this is so fun. I just love listening to all of you. I really appreciate it. My most reasonable, from my, I guess the caveat is I'm trying to ascertain my own most reasonable position, which feels sort of like I'm Ouroboros. But, it's simple. We're not alone. And reality is bigger and stranger than we can imagine or have imagined. And that the arc of growth and change and development is infinite, and just the universe is as big on the inside as it is on the outside. It's those kinds of things that I feel like are just pretty reasonable items we should be able to discuss and feel our way into in normal, polite, everyday society and personal and with strangers. They just seem really reasonable to me, at least. The unreasonable stuff is very interesting. Just to touch on, as I put my foot into that pool a little bit, one of the things that I have noticed and that I have also been guilty of is that people don't even tell you the really weird shit that's happening to them until you get a long way down the story with them. They wait, they watch, they see how the relationship's going to go. It might be a year before someone tells you what's really been going on for them. I'm guilty of that. There have been things that have happened to me that I can't even or won't even at this point talk about. I don't want to. I'm still ruminating and living with them in a way that they haven't gone over the threshold yet, and I don't know when they will. But I've seen that as common and universal and reliable as the doubleness is that facet, which is you're not really going to find the deep shit out until later on in the story. The unreasonable part for me is this feeling of worry and concern that we are unwittingly in a forfeiture. And the forfeiture is that it could be described in a lot of different ways. One of them being because we have not taking the authorship and command of our own experience and our own position on the planet in the way that we have had the opportunity to. Because we have not done that, it has created an opportunity for entities that are opportunistic, that have an agenda and an objective that doesn't conform and necessarily have our highest and deepest good as the end result. And they see an opportunity, and we're forfeiting our chance to collectively conduct the kind of hygiene that I was talking about just in my own personal practice. I worry in an unreasonable sense that humanity is forfeiting the planet, and that these interlopers are going to come in and they're going to have their day with it eventually. I mean, I've met people that are self-avowed hybrids. I have met, I have a handful of really strange experiences in that category. And we all know that's one of the narratives that's out there. That's like they're going to insert all these hybrids, and there's going to be a shift in the power structure, and it's going to become about some different thing. And my unreasonable fear around that is that we would forfeit our sovereignty. We would forfeit our autonomy. I believe one of the great gifts and miracles of the human being is our sovereignty, our uniqueness, our creativity, and that is profoundly at the center of what I feel is sacred. And so the concern I have around there is that maybe that is truly uniquely human. I have one thing that's shifted for me in the past few years is that I don't assume or presume that any of these entities are necessarily our spiritual superiors. I don't know that that's the case at all. Maybe they're not even our equals in some regards, in the nature of what our soul is and how precious that is. And so my unreasonable fear is that that forfeiture might be underway.
Wow. Yeah, those are just incredible thoughts from everybody. Reasonable thoughts, I guess probably I've already said, like UFO is hyperobject, the psychic state as the possibility for the next kind of a basis or a parallel for us to think about as the next potential structure of human consciousness. And the UFO is some kind of harbinger, magnet, intensifier, refiner's fire along that line. Unreasonable thought would be maybe it's more an absurdist position. Maybe it's an idiosyncratic, like my humor absurdist position. So if I always tend to I want to think of a third, if I have a positive, negative, or reasonable, unreasonable. Cow tipping, is this weird human phenomenon where people in rural high school kids always think it's hilarious to tip a cow over. And nobody can ever explain why it's funny, but it's endlessly humorous to everybody. And it's kind of a dick move, right? If we're being honest, it's not like the worst thing ever, but it's some pranksterism. And tip a cow over, falls over while it's sleeping. There's a whole weird synchronicity there of sleep plus cows and the mutilation phenomenon potentially. But anyway, the cow tipping. And sometimes I just wonder, maybe they're just cow tipping us. Maybe this whole thing is just one really long-running, ridiculous, over-the-top, Monty Python, Douglas Adams kind of absurdist humor that we're never going to be in on. That just, I took them up in a craft, and I showed them secret symbols, and I told them that they were all deeply meaningful, and it's going to end. And they just think that this is never gets old, and this is their thing to do on the weekend. I don't know. That's about as absurd as I get. It helps to have some humor, I think, in the midst of what can be some really strange and even terrifying kind of stuff. So maybe they're just cow tipping us.
That's hilarious. And I really liked the juxtaposition of Stuart's deep and concerning
Loss of sovereignty.
of the forfeiture and of the yeah, that's something. I think the most reasonable thing I could say is probably what at least some of our integral audience is hoping I will say, and that is that wherever we're seeing UFO phenomenon, it's either projection on mundane phenomena, or it's US military experiments or German military experiments or Russian military experiments, and that it's all human generated and either out of our own psychic reservoirs where we're projecting things, or we're we've got secret government programs and things like that that are not yet disclosed, and that they will be in time, right? So I could stand right on the edge, and I can also disappoint those integral friends by saying that I've encountered some of that at least. I remember back when I was in Sedona, of course in Sedona, where before any of the the Men in Black stuff came out in the popular media, there were still people talking about Men in Black in the kind of grassroots at the time. This was back in the 80s. And so there weren't any big things, out in the media yet about that. But I was hearing that there were people encountering Men in Black. And so that's an interesting phenomenon. You know, it's very much now popular cultural thing. And I actually think there's something really real to it, in that one time, you know, I was working in a convenience store. I was the night clerk there overnight, with the coyotes howling through the speakers from the gas station and haunting, you know, the empty gas station out in the middle of the desert. And these people wandered in out of the desert, all covered in dust and pieces of like, you know, sagebrush or whatever in their clothes, and they looked completely dazed. And they were walking around in the store and not doing anything. They were just staring at stuff, you know. And then they finally sat down in the corner of the store, and they were just sitting in the corner. And I walked over to them, and I asked them, "What's going on?" You know, and they didn't want to say anything. And so I went and got them some drinks, and I gave them some drinks. And gradually they opened up and said that, they said, "Have you ever heard of like government guys, you know, all in black?" I said, "Yeah." And actually, at that time, I said, "No, I wasn't really sure about that." But they said that they're government guys who wear all in black, and that they, you know, are related to experiences of lights in the sky. And they said that they'd been involved in something, and that they had been mixed up. They'd had some unusual experiences, and they were being pursued by these guys. And I thought, well, maybe these are just high people, and you know, I didn't know what sense to make of it. But I gave them some food, and they left. And a little while later, a federal agent walked in to the store and asked me if I had seen any people. And I said, yeah, and they went off that way, and he left. And then a little while later in the early morning, I saw a car being hauled by a tow truck, that it was all crashed. And they had told me that they had been chased by these men in black, and their car had rolled. So I thought, okay, maybe it's real, maybe it's not. But then later, I actually was, I'd heard that there was, I'm getting into a long story here, I hope you enjoy it. I had heard that there was a mountain out in the wilderness where there's a secret base. And I also totally dismissed that. I thought this was ridiculous. This is just part of Sedona woo-woo stuff. And then I was at my house, which was right at the edge of the forest land, and I could look out in the horizon and actually see that mountain. And I started hearing these noises, and like 4 black helicopters, completely unmarked, with men in all black uniforms, were flying directly over our house. And they had the doors open, and one guy was leaning out of the door and flashing this floodlight at the mountain, just doing some kind of signaling like that. And I got up in the roof of my house, and I stood there and watched. One guy in one black helicopter actually came back and circled my house and looked down at me. And then they went off towards that mountain. And that happened for several mornings in a row. I saw these guys going in the direction of that mountain and flashing these lights over there. I told some friends about it. Their dads were ex-Vietnam guys. They took off into the woods to go see what was going on over there. And they said they actually got stopped at one point by a guy all in black on a horse who said, you can't go farther. So that's where the reasonable, that is all government stuff, crosses over into the unreasonable, where it's totally right there in the pop culture, men in black, secret, you know, where's the boundary there? That's, you know, an interesting line for me to figure out what's really happening there. Further afield in the unreasonable, I like what Whitley Strieber's kid said to him at one point, which was, Dad, if I followed out into space far enough, would I end up back in my mind? Is there like a loop, right? And I like that. I like this sense of this Mobius kind of quality between the inner and the outer. And the deeper we go here, the more we encounter out there, and vice versa. And that, to me, points to the kind of entanglements that several of you described in the sense of the unreasonable. I'll probably lose my job after telling that story.
Well, one of us will hire you for something else.
Okay.
What one thing does the UFO community or the world need now or next to move our understanding and our ability to work with this phenomenon forward?
I think teasing apart the positions that are actually held within the UFO community. You know, one of the great things about something like integrative meta theory is that it goes a step beyond relativism, gives it some structure. It's not just that there's a bunch of different perspectives. There's these particular relatively stable types of perspectives. And I think something like that has to happen within the UFO community so that people in the community and people outside the community have a clear sense of what the positions are that people hold there. Because I think to a lot of people, one of the reasons it's not credible is just that it's a huge ball of ambiguity and they're not sure what positions are held. Whether you're going to talk to somebody who thinks it's a Star Trek thing or it's a government black ops occult program, or whether you're talking to a shaman or what's going on. So some sense of stably teasing apart the basic categories that are at play, I think, is an important next step to set it in motion. But as a subset of that, I think one of the categories that needs to be set free and isn't touched on enough is something like ideological fantasy projection. And what I mean is people who have this feeling that just after World War II, centered in America, something happened. It involved the government. It involved private corporations. It involved the military-industrial complex. Something was set up. It was something alien or inhuman, might even have been an attack on modern society to some degree. People who sort of hold that model and that it needs to be disclosed and that it's out there, it's all over, that did happen in terms of socioeconomics, right? That did happen at the political level of the system that we live in. So there's a kind of, a Marxist critique or an ideological critique of the system that I think a lot of people sense, and they don't go far enough to become critical thinkers about the political economy. Instead, they take this bypass into the mythological version, and they hook that onto the UFO community. So I think if we could sort of tease that out a little bit, we'd be able to set those people free to be better ideological critiques of our culture. And we'd also set the UFO community free to focus more on the specific aspects of its phenomenon that aren't mythological projection of our background sense of what's going wrong in the society.
Nice. Yeah, I really like that, Layman. Thank you. A couple things come to mind. One is I'm very fascinated by the taboo of this topic. And so I think part of what the world needs at this point is we need to talk about the taboo. Like, if we can't talk about UFOs, let's at least talk about the taboo around UFOs. And that's starting to happen a little more because I really see the taboo, and given how strong it is, as actual evidence for the existence of the phenomenon, and think of it as collective shadow. And so I think there's a lot of collective shadow work we can and need to do around this so that we can have a sophisticated conversation about it, because the implications of this phenomenon are so far-reaching. We really need our best hearts and minds on the task. And if there's a taboo that's preventing those people from entering into the conversation, then I think there's an obligation to try and tend to the taboo and deconstruct it to the point where more sophisticated thinkers and researchers and spiritual practitioners can enter in and share their thoughts and experiences, so we can start to make better collective meaning out of this. I think we've been very much castrated in our meaning-making process as a culture around this phenomenon. So that's one. The other is a meta view. I really think we need a meta view because there's so much evidence. I mean, there's a ton of evidence, and there's a cacophony of views and perspectives, and no one really has a good integral vantage point from which to see some or most of it. And so how do we compile the different types of evidence? How do we sort through the methods and the perspectives in a way that does justice to the true but partial, but as Layman was saying, but kind of moves us forward, not just with an aperspectival madness, but with a set of positions that are defendable, that are thoughtful, that are standing on critical thinking, but are also, open and allowing room for, epistemic reflexivity. The next piece is, kind of ontological flooding. And I really thank Stuart for turning me on to Jack Hunter's work and anthropology. And he has this idea of ontological flooding, which basically is just taking things seriously, right? So like if an abductee tells you a story about their experience that you take it very seriously. Like you're very open to the possibility that what they're saying to you more or less is some sense real and true. So I think we need to take this phenomenon much more seriously, and we need to kind of move out of just the knee-jerk skeptical position, which I think is a healthy part of this. But I just think we're over-identified with that, and that we really need to find ways to take the phenomena seriously, individually and collectively. And then I think that leads into the last point, is I think we need to reevaluate what's real and what's proof. And I think we're saddled with some very outdated scientific, materialistic, positivist views of reality. And, as Bruce was highlighting before, this really requires an integral methodological pluralism. So how do we substantiate a broad empiricism in the context of the UFO inquiry so that we can validate, this phenomena in a way that's satisfactory, so that we can move into more interesting layers of inquiry and conversation than getting hung up on the, is it real or true, or, I really want to find a way to move beyond that while still honoring the importance of that inquiry. But I just think it's created a ceiling that's not useful.
Wow. What I would love to see happen is an initiative of a population of human beings claiming their agency, and instead of arguing about the reality status of this or that, or interpretations of the origin of phenomena, which part of it's real, which is not, like I would like to just, the vision I see in my head is we just walk away, stop doing that, walk off, get a population of human beings together with a coherent cosmology and worldview grounded in depth and substance and practice, and actively voice from our human perspective that this needs to be a relationship. Instead of us being passive experiencers of things that either randomly are happening to us that seem enchanted or traumatizing, or being sucked out of our houses and abduction experiences, or just like the whole host of how large that menu is, instead of being those kinds of experiencers, if we could form a population of people that could get together and cohere and voice that, number one, our sovereignty is real and we claim it and we're going to protect it. Number two, we want relationships. We don't just want to be commodities for things that operate in the shadow. And I do believe that there is a great variety, that this is not all good, it's not all bad. This is a deep, nuanced set of enigmas. But if I have a fantasy, it's that sometime, I would love for my daughters to grow up in a world where there is a completely different kind of response from humanity, which claims our sovereignty, claims our autonomy, and demands that it's a relationship and not just us being victims or random experiencers of these exotic events. So that's what I would hope for.
Wow, that's really beautiful. That's really powerful. Thank you for that, Stuart. That was, I think, mostly what I was going to say, but you said it way more beautifully and with a stronger rhetoric and power than I ever could. So maybe simply to add a different piece, because others have really named, I think, crucial stuff. Just from where I mostly sit with it is working with individuals who've had various experiences. The ontological flooding and weird naturalism is really important, as is a basic statement of people's sanity. There's just so much, even within kind of new agey and alternative and whatever's kind of spiritual world, like people will tell me all kinds of stuff that happens to them on ayahuasca trips or mushrooms, or they had a dream that came to be, or grandma came to visit, from beyond the veil, all these kinds of things that are, wouldn't be the norm necessarily that people might hear. But this topic is of an even other category, even though when we actually look at it, it's actually deeply interwoven with, like we said, the dead and near-death experience and psychic dimensions of the earth and whatever. But it has so much emotional charge because of the taboo that Sean named. It's very frightening for people, and it really leaves people questioning their own mental and emotional well-being. And so just even a space where people, it's okay to have had these experiences and not immediately get into an agenda. Okay, so what day was it and what time was it, and can we prove there was lights in the sky, and or let's all turn it into some goofy cultish religion, and we've got a whole big narrative to pre-feed you about what your experience must be, or it's a totally sinister, diabolical, demonic thing that you need to be exorcised from. Just for people to hear that they're still humans in the midst of all of this, and to have someone who actually cares about them and doesn't bother with the whole let's prove or disprove your experience, and actually let's figure out if it's occurring in some degree in consciousness or some form of psychic capacity, it's real enough. And I always like Charles Fort's idea of like the intermediate, that it's both real and unreal simultaneously. So we don't have to kind of get too hung up on our interpretations, but we don't have to undermine our own agency, like Stuart was saying either. I think that's, to me, that's like, you know, knowing's half the battle or whatever. G.I. Joe here to aliens. Like, I think that itself is such an incredible statement that so many people need to hear. And then there's so much more that could be built off of that others have named.
I would say pretty much yes to all that you've shared so far. And I'm thinking if I could bring in any additional pieces on what Chris just shared about maybe the therapeutic dimension that we could take. I'm thinking in transpersonal psychology, where they make the distinction or the category of psychotic experiences with mystical features, or mystical experiences with psychotic features, and really being able to help feel into that territory where actually, you know, we can maybe better identify where people are having anomalous experiences while retaining their organizing center, and where those experiences are happening where you can tell that actually they're in a manic episode or they've lost their organizing center, and really have some clarity and discernment around that, which is something that the transpersonal field is really trying to do, not to write off everything that appears anomalous as something that is psychotic and needs to be medicated, but there are these in-between territories that really need to be worked with discernment, and I think this whole phenomenon could be related to in that way. One thing that I would want to add that I think will lead to our next and really getting close to the final question is for there to be better art, better cultural outputs, integrally informed cultural outputs that can begin shifting narratives and opening up perspectives, and, you know, playing in science fiction and art and music and video games and other territories, which already is happening. It's already happening, but I think we could up that a little bit, bringing in, you know, more integral perspectives and scope on how we're entertaining the multiple dimensions of this, and without we have freedom in the realm of art without having to say yes, this is real, or no, this isn't real. It actually allows us to enter spaces where we can think and experience differently and begin to see that the world can cohere in this way. So I think that there could be some powerful additional work, and, you know, beyond what's already happening in that area.
What art has most informed or resonated with your overall sense of this phenomenon?
Because I mentioned ideological critique in my last answer, I'd like to do a little shout out to John Carpenter's They Live, which I think is excellent. And I also want to do a shout out to Twin Peaks, which I could talk about for hours in terms of its relevance to me and this phenomenon. But those aren't the two things that really come up for me. The two pieces of art that really come up for me are one particular episode of The X-Files that I saw as a kid, Jose Chung's From Outer Space, it was called. It's kind of a comic episode, but everything is happening at once in that episode. There's an event in a town, but everybody recollects it differently. There's hypnosis, there's government conspiracy, there's inter-nation competition to fake UFOs, as well as some actual entities that are confusing the people who are faking the UFOs, right? There's every kind of layer of experience in a weird mandalic nest. And when I saw that as a kid, for some reason, I felt that's realistic. So that the ability to bring all of those together, you know, and the irony and the fluidity and the meta framing to hold that and to make a piece of art where all that stuff is true and there's nowhere to get your footing exactly, but you're having a good time. The other thing that gave me that experience a little bit was a Richard Gere movie called The Mothman Prophecies. He's been touched by death and he goes to this town and he starts running into this entity that people all over the town are, but the entity is like a field. It's distributed in space and time. And it's very vexing and it communicates through different identities. And finally he goes to see this expert and this guy's like, I don't talk about this stuff anymore. And he says, yeah, it knew the future though. And the guy says, yeah, we're up in a building. We can look down and you can see a car coming before it hits someone. You have a different perspective. It's not magic. And Richard Gere says to him, yeah, but they're trying to communicate something to us. And the guy says, have you ever tried to make yourself intelligible to a cockroach? It's just not going to happen. And there's something beautiful about the challenge in that utter incommensurability of perspectives that always turned me on.
Nice. Yeah, I really love the artwork that emerges out of this space, and there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. It's hard to track down. I think I've been successful at getting my hands on the few books that kind of present visual art along these lines, but also there's a whole interesting thing around music. You know, if you really look at the history of rock and roll and music, and Grant Cameron and a few others, Michael Luckman have looked at the extraterrestrial influence on music, and it's quite extensive. So there's a lot of really great songs out there that have a transmission dealing with this phenomenon. But and Stuart and I have even talked about, somehow we need to manifest an art show that travels around to different cities and, present some of this work. Because I think the arts are a very powerful way of working with kind of mass awareness and kind of educating the public around this phenomenon. In terms of kind of visual art that's really spoke to me, I really love David Huggins's, work around the love and saucer stuff. And, he's done 150 or so paintings just detailing his own experiences over, his lifetime, starting when he was like 8. And he's never done hypnotic regression, so it's all conscious recall. And those paintings are just terrifying, and they're beautiful, and there's just a potency in them. And when there's so many of them and you kind of can feel into the landscape of his story, it's just really remarkable. Because a lot of other art you see is just kind of a one-off, or someone just shows a picture of the beans coming out of the craft as they experienced it, or they do a couple pictures. But David's really tells a story that I think is really captivating. The other artwork that has really spoken to me is Vashta. She's a intuitive artist, and she has a webpage called Galactic Art, and she basically works with these beings to then use a 3D program on the computer to create essentially photographs, what largely look more like photographs than paintings, of the various beings, and that she's interacting with, or that her clients are interacting with, that she's then connecting with in order to produce an image. And she's very clear that this is not to be taken as an objective picture of them, but more of like her energetic experience of these beings. But these beings sometimes will say to her, no, the eyes need to be a little bigger, or, oh, that should be blue instead of green, or like, so there's kind of a collaborative process she's involved in with them. And the images are just stunning. And what I love about them is they really, for me, help deconstruct our tendency to view all extraterrestrials through the icon of the gray. And even in our better moments, we expand that out to being the Nordics, the reptilians, and the mantis beings, and the grays. And there's like 5, right? But Vashta's work really shows that there are hundreds of variations on these beings, and they're exquisite, and they're very foreign and they're very familiar, and they just run the gamut. And she does a lot of images of the hybrid children that are, very beautiful and disconcerting, as you see our own humanity reflected in them, but also something very alien in there as well. So I find her work to be very powerful kind of antidote to the simplistic, cartoonish images we often have of these beings. And for me, it's kind of helped reimagine the beautiful cultural and bio, or subtle diversity of these intelligences. And then lastly, just a big shout out to Stuart with his Is Language and the artwork he does, where the picture is actually created out of language, because I really love the light languages, and I love looking at different people's, channeling or expressions of light languages. But I particularly love it when they then use the light language to create an image. And Stuart does that at such a profound scale, where it's just like, in the process you go through, Stuart, really feels like it gets close to what I think this type of artwork should be, where it's like, it's a full body experience. It's like, it's got multiple layers of meaning. There's the image itself, but then there's the language that makes up the image. And then there's the meaning of the language that's also in some sense describing the image. So to have like this multidimensional art as you do, and the transmission that comes from that, I just find exquisite. And Stuart's also working on films. And so the last thing I'll just say is, I really feel like there's been some really good films, like Arrival, for instance, or Interstellar, that I think get at a more interesting layer of this phenomenon. But I think there's a lot more room to go. And I really want to champion what I think of as kind of speculative nonfiction, where, we make movies that are much more accurate to the phenomenon than what currently is out there. And I, just to give an example, I imagine a very powerful, beautiful story about a woman who discovers that she has hybrid children on a craft, and her process of coming to terms with that. And that, in a sense, the movie's not really about her and the hybrid children in the sense of the alien other. It's more about the human heart-wrenching story of the mother and the child, and separation, and dealing with difference, and what is that process. So I think there's so many domains our art can go to support us in exploring and coming to terms with this phenomenon, that I just really look forward to, that happening more and more, because I just think art's such a powerful modality, and we really need art to support us in supporting this relationship that we're in the process of cultivating with these other intelligences.
Well, I love this question. Obviously, it's very, very close to my heart. This is the center of my world, more or less, in part because my experiences led me off on an odyssey where I did nothing for 5 years except for write these. It's a trilogy of films called Mantis 1, Mantis 2, Mantis 3. Enlisted a small army of people and trying to get them made, and that's its whole an odyssey unto itself. And I could not agree more with the sentiment that art really possesses a special opportunity for us to circumvent a lot of the stuff that catches us up and slows us down, and the never-ending arguments and all that. And art just has this magic, keeping the enigma more so than usual, where it lives, how it lives. You can feel your way into that. And I think that possesses its own developmental force. It's a kind of driver and an engine that I just think is so precious and sacred. And so in my own life, that's pretty much all I've done since 2012, is try to bring these works to life. Not just the Mantis films, but also developed a TV series called Aliens and Artists, which is exactly about the kind of stuff that Sean was touching on a bit, whether it's David Huggins or Emily Trim, who's a acquaintance of mine who was at the Ariel School. She literally stood face to face with one of these entities for 10 or 12 minutes. And what happened and how she has dealt with it, what she's turned it into, is thousands and thousands of works of art. Her entire life is a fire hydrant of art that has, to this day, continued to pour out of her in a fashion that's unmistakably a phenomenon unto itself, which is what happens to creativity through one of these encounters. I mean, my time with that mantis entity was probably around a minute, and yet I have devoted years and thousands of hours of making artwork, trying to have a more meaningful and to heal, to make sense of it, and to try to grow as a human being with that at the center of that mobile, that center of gravity. And so I look at folks, another very interesting thing we wouldn't have time to get into today, but that I'm endlessly curious about is, so you take someone like, there's this little family of painters that I find myself ruminating on all the time. One of them is Bud Hopkins. So Bud Hopkins is fascinating to me because he's almost the inverse of an Emily Trim. Bud Hopkins was a very successful, respected abstract expressionist painter with a great career, started working with experiencers, and kiss it goodbye. The rest of his life was about working with experiencers. And I think Bud is fascinating because he's the inverse in the sense of like the UFOs, UAPs, the abduction experiences stuff never touched his painting. He almost insulated and hermetically sealed off his painting work and refused to be influenced or inspired by it in any way. It's like he's this anti-hero to me in a painting way. I'm fascinated by that. And then on the other side of it, you have Peter Robbins, who worked with Bud. They were close. Peter was his right-hand man, and they did years and years of work together. Peter was the same thing, successful, burgeoning, brilliant artist who conversely had this crazy experience with his sister, who was, by the way, a rock and roll singer. Her entire life became about this in a creative sense. Peter stopped painting. He never painted again. He's only done the UFO thing, and I've had conversations with him recently. I'm hoping to go and film a documentary on him. He's just now, 50, 60 years later, getting back into creating visual artwork. And the way that it stopped him, in the converse fashion that it started someone like an Emily Trim, I think is a very rich, untapped mystery for us to look into. And when I went in to build that TV series, Aliens and Artists, I just touched the tip of the iceberg and I found 50. Some of them are very famous. You've got the Jimi Hendrixes, you got the Moody Blues, and there's all of that lore that you may be familiar with. There's an entire other population of artists who aren't famous, who have had an experience, and it obliterates, it eclipses, it consumes them for the rest of their life. It never lets them go, and all they can do is make art about it. And I think that's a whole rich thing I'm hoping to get to dive into. So that's sort of one side of it. The flip for me personally, the artwork that I have found to be cathartic and helpful, starting with 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was the first film that made trans-rational sense to me of what this menu of phenomena is. The last 15 minutes of Space Odyssey was the first time that my soul felt in coherence with the nature of the enigma. Because I felt like Stanley, at least for me, truly got us into the trans-rational space and was able to, more so than most others, meet it where it lives and bring us where it is instead of shrinking it down into something more digestible in commercial terms in the cinema. So that one was a big one for me. I could make a long list. I agree. Arrival was amazing. That was such a high point and a hopeful mark. Are Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington, who are both surrealist, sort of spiritually, animistically infused, absurdist visionaries. They both passed away, but they were alive in the past century. And the both of their work in combination makes the most sense to me in that bandwidth that is the enchanted animating presence that is permeates and bleeds over into these puzzles that we've been talking about today, but that is native to this planet. Both of those painters possessed a kind of intuitive, expressive capacity that I just find strangely soothing, even though a lot of the work is a little bit disturbing from time to time. I find it soothing because they have registered and expressed it in a fashion that I feel, again, is commensurate with the puzzle itself. So that's it for me.
Mm. No, Sean, I really appreciated that you gave a shout out to Stuart, because Because I think, Stuart, for example, when you were on Weird Studies podcast and started, which was more the kind of extended reflection of your experience, to me, for anyone who's, you know, thinking of other places to go, that to me is one of the most lucid, numinous, and sort of genuine and sincere entries into this phenomenon, really. Like kind of in my book, kind of up there with like Strieber, and there's also a guy by the name of Mike Clelland. I don't know if anybody's heard of him, who wrote, he's written a couple books now, which are reflecting on his experience of the interrelationship between the UFO phenomenon and strange encounters with owls, which has opened up this whole other, like he gets emails, letters, correspondence from people all over the place of their similar type interesting correlation between owls and this phenomenon, which again brings us back to this kind of, you know, how many different interrelated aspects there are to this phenomenon. And I find his writing very poetic. He doesn't have he's not, you know, again, pushing an agenda per se. He's reflecting deeply and I think really carefully and conscientiously and thoughtfully on his own experience. So that would be one person I would, whose art, it's in a written form, but whose art I find the aesthetics of it really powerful. A documentary I watched recently called Witness to Another World. That's the English translation. It's a Spanish film, which is the story of a Argentinian gaucho guy from a sort of village who had an encounter as a boy. And through the encounter starts having memories of the future and sort of classic shamanic initiatory type dynamics activated. He's essentially alienated and ostracized from his village. He's not accepted as some kind of a shaman or a medicine man or anything like this. And he's pushed out and he lives out on the margins in a kind of imposed hermetic exile, which has a real tragedy to it. And the filmmaker and Jacques Vallée come down. And what's really beautiful is just the way that they try to sit with him and just hear him. Like incredible stuff occurs in the movie where his mom reveals things that she hasn't even revealed to her son, which are somewhat tragic, beautiful, numinous, confusing. But in terms of like the ancestral patterning that tends to occur, which is something we haven't really mentioned, but that this phenomena tends to, not always, but tends to exist through lineages. And often that's unknown by the people who've had those experiences themselves because of the taboo that they don't even know that their parents or grandparents or an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a sibling has gone through a similar kind of thing, which can fracture families. So it's, to me, it's the, as a document, you know, too many of the other documentaries are always pushing an agenda of various, whatever their view on the matter is. But this one to me was actually a really beautiful encounter with the numinous in this man's life. And it's definitely not all like an initiatory thing. It's not all rose petals and lilies. But the experience clearly does waken psychic capacity in his being. And he's trying to figure out how to deal with that. So I really recommend that one as a really beautiful, caring, kind of compassionate way of starting to approach this topic.
Yeah, it really is an amazing film. And the pace of it is very different than a lot of films. Like it's just, I wouldn't say it's a slow film, but it just goes with a pace that like matches the material in a really exquisite way.
Yeah.
I do, with several others of you, really appreciate Stuart's work. I love the crow images and the combination with his language. To me, there's this combining of the shamanic with the ET type experience that's happening in that kind of expression, which really resonates with me with some of the types of experiences in Arizona that seem to blend between those two kinds of worlds. When I was a young boy, I'm going to choose a popular film, but Close Encounters of the Third Kind really impacted me when I was a young boy. I remember I was immersed at that time in writing science fiction and dipping into it a little bit. And I think the arrival of the mothership actually pushed me into an experience, my first experience of glossolalia. I just started ecstatically speaking some kind of other tongue when that mothership was landing. It just totally moved me in the theater. And then the musical exchange, that was to me just the fantastic way for the civilizations to begin to communicate and encounter each other. So I really loved that. And I loved Arrival with this experimentation with thought and with metaphysics and with language. I used to write a lot of science fiction, and if I ever got back into that, it would probably be a, alien encounter, an encounter with other beings kind of narrative. I always watch these films and they never quite go where I want them to go. So I keep thinking, I have to do it. I have to do it my way, so maybe one day that's going to happen. So anyway, I really appreciated everything you've shared, and you've given a lot of resources, which maybe we can link in the video description so people can check out some of that artwork.
What most surprised or enchanted you, or seemed really useful to you, in what someone else said here today?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, when Stuart was talking, I suddenly realized I should have mentioned Valis by Philip K. Dick, which is possibly the best literary version of an actual experience in which there's a musician who's trying to make a movie about the actual experiences he had in the same. Second of all, I'm having a great time, and if anybody wants to, have one-on-one conversations where we dive down into some more specific areas of this, I'm always open to that. Thirdly, what impressed me today, or what lingers in the back of my mind, I think, there's an idea that came up that maybe we're their hallucination to some degree. I love that. I love Chris's bringing it back to trauma. That really interested me a lot. But also, I guess a lot of it's coming together for me around this idea of an aperspectival iceberg. When I watch the movie Titanic, I always think modernity is the iceberg. But I think we're going forward to this other iceberg, and it's an iceberg where you can't really hold a perspective, right? That thing, that vexation, the koan of all of this, where it's intercategorial, where it violates categories, it's got an inherent doubleness, it's inside and it's outside. I think we're going to hit something like that as a culture and as individuals, and that's what's going to throw us, or force us. The friction of that is going to force us into the next stage to some degree. And I think I heard a lot of people say something like that today.
Yeah, there were just so many great gems that I got from each of you. I think what's more prominent in my awareness is just how deeply satisfying it's been to be with all of you over the last couple hours, and just the quality of conversation. Because, I think we all face the existential aloneness of, being interested in these conversations, but not always having the right, conversational partners or context to really kind of spiral in to the different layers. So to me, just the combination of like the seriousness that everyone brought to this, the thoughtfulness, the funny moments, the laughter, the cosmic galactic cow tipping, which I think is so spot on. It always amazes me with these stories where like a guy goes up in a spacecraft and the alien beings give him this rock and he's like totally excited. It's like, this is the smoking gun. And then he takes the rock to the lab, and the lab basically says, it's just common granite, probably from, 20 miles away at the quarry, so there's just like, there's this cosmic jokester that just seems to go all the time with this, but also just the heartfeltness, the vulnerability that I think all of us brought, and sharing from a place of depth that often doesn't accompany these conversations, and just the general openness. So I'm just so pleased, Bruce, that you've really spearheaded this along with Layman. Really excited to bring this together and just support other people in the integral community and beyond, to to take on exploring and expressing their own experiences, because over and over again, I'm just struck at how many people in the integral community in particular have come to me and shared their experiences. Like, Mike Cleland's work's amazing. And I've had two good friends come to me and tell me their owl stories, one of which was an encounter with a 6-foot owl on top of a car, a la Screen Memory. And another was each night, one night, one owl was outside the window. The next night, 2 owls were outside hooting. The next night, 3 owls were outside hooting. The next night, 4 owls were outside hooting, right? So there's just those kinds of bizarre experiences you can't make sense of. And so I think we're helping to create a safer place to bring the taboo down so that more people can share their experiences. Because like Stuart, you said, you usually have to be friends with someone for a long, long time before they even will let this toothpaste out of the bottle. So just kudos to all of us for, hopefully helping to make it easier for others out there.
Wow. Yeah, I want to echo and affirm how much it means for me to be able to be a part of this conversation, but even more so how much it means just that this conversation is coming into being. To hear, I got so much from each of you. It was just amazing. I don't know what I'd pay to hear, just audit this conversation and be a fly on the wall, but I would. I just feel so encouraged that this level of dialogue and listening and inquiry and living the unknown and the question of it, which I feel each of us doing in our respective ways, is so hopeful to me. I think that if a handful of us can get together in this fashion and have this quality to our conversation and inquiry, there's no reason why that can't be the case for a culture, for an entire, this is a microculture we're getting going here. And it also reminds me of the profound appreciation and gratitude I have for Integral in general, because the feeling that I have being in conversation with each of you here today, which is so affirming and hopeful for me, and also healing and cathartic, is the same experience that I had when I found Integral initially all those years ago, when I first started hanging out with Ken, and I realized, there's this, when I read Sex Ecology, Spirituality, and I thought, my entire consciousness moved about in a different way in which I felt like this is going to be workable. Like being a human being felt so much more workable and beautiful and exciting than it did before I had encountered Integral. So that experience is renewed in me today, and I feel more optimistic and enthusiastic. And the other thing that I would share is that an image that, or an echo that comes up for me experientially, is when the Berlin Wall fell and when the Soviet Union fell. And I remember as a kid, it was unimaginable to me that the Soviet Union would fall. I didn't conceive of it as a possibility. I sincerely thought I would live out my entire lifetime with the existence of the Soviet Union and the stasis of the Cold War being this intractable reality that we were all just going to live under. It shook loose this strata of my being in which I realized, big, huge things can happen that you never would have thought possible on a global scale, on a massive social scale. Hundreds of millions of lives can be shifted into a new reality and potentiality within a very short span of time. And I feel a similar potential with this enigma, with these phenomena, in which it seems impossible on the one hand that we should cross over the threshold and into an entirely new relationship with it. And then on the other hand, it feels, as I sit here with you today, inevitable. It feels inevitable that if there are going to be human beings, if we're here in 1,000 years, we will get to an entirely new relationship. We will get to inhabit ourselves in an entirely new way. And that promise is one of the main things that I take away from this conversation, and I'm super grateful for it. So, and I also want to touch on what Layman offered as well, which is I'm happy to continue conversations one-on-one. I would love to speak with any of you or collectively or whatever way it is. Just consider me available and interested for that.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Bruce, especially for organizing this, conjuring us all into being here. just to echo what everyone said, I think this kind of a conversation, the depth of it and the care and the humor and the willingness to explore and not take yourselves too seriously, but also be really serious, is what this topic needs. There's just way too much, debunkers and skeptics who are aggressive and kind of nihilistically out to undermine people. There's too much focus, at least in some of the old days, on the nuts and bolts of denying the psychic side of the phenomenon. And then on the psychic side, there's way too much woo-woo and kind of muddy, soft, kind of mushy thinking and cultish kind of stuff that's gone on historically. It's really important to see like this kind of a conversation is what can happen, and I think what needs to happen, not like let's toot our own horns, we're all geniuses. That's not what I'm saying, but like the care and the thoughtfulness to be willing to enter into this kind of ontological flood and care about aesthetics and ethics and the well-being of people, and to be creative and imaginative and be willing to try to bring our minds while always knowing that there's some kind of elusive element, slippery element here in play, I think is what's important to see, that this conversation can have maturation, and it gives permission, I think, for other people who might have had their own experiences and are really scared or reticent to share them for fear of social, judgment or ostracization. It's actually here, like, it's okay. There's a space, it's safe, there's good people. And I'm also totally always up for conversations going forward. So thanks everybody, and thanks Bruce.
Yes, thanks to all of you. I've known all of you for years, or at least about you, and I'm now so delighted to learn how really weird all of you are. It's really rewarding. I don't feel alone. It's been a rich, wonderful exchange, and I really feel there's a lot of promise. We've covered a lot of territory, and yet it also feels like it's opened up so much more space for something more to happen. And so I definitely am open and excited to hosting more conversations with you about these topics individually or as a group. And hope we can keep in communication about that. And just thank you for everything you've brought to this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
And